The 27th of June, 1954. Guatemala City. A democratically elected president boarded a plane into exile. His land reforms dismantled. His revolution crushed not by soldiers, but by businessmen. There were no tanks in the streets, no invasion flags. Just boardroom memos, banana crates, and the quiet influence of a U.S. corporation with Washington on speed dial. It started with a railroad. In the late 1800s, an ambitious American named Minor C. Keith was building rail lines in Costa Rica, hoping to move goods across the jungle to the Caribbean coast. To feed his workers, he planted bananas along the tracks. The bananas thrived and quickly became more profitable than the railroad itself. By 1899, Keith merged his banana business with the Boston Fruit Company to create the United Fruit Company, a new kind of enterprise that didn't just grow fruit, it owned it, controlled it, exported it. And before long, it wasn't just exporting bananas, it was exporting power. The company expanded rapidly through Central America and the Caribbean, acquiring vast tracts of land in Guatemala, Honduras, Panama, Colombia, and Costa Rica. In some countries, United Fruit owned half the arable land. It controlled the ports, the railroads, the communication lines. It operated like a state within a state, complete with its own rules, guards, and influence. The company's nickname in the region said it all: El Pulpo, the octopus, because its tentacles reached everywhere. It wasn't just agriculture, it was infrastructure. If you wanted to get your goods to market, you used United Fruit's railways. If you wanted to trade, you docked at their ports. If you crossed them, you didn't trade at all. It also became a master of vertical integration, controlling every part of the supply chain, from plantation to shipping to market shelf. This made competition nearly impossible and dependency inevitable. Small farmers couldn't compete, governments couldn't resist. But their most valuable asset wasn't land, it was leverage. United Fruit didn't simply exist in these countries, it shaped them. It backed politicians who protected its interests. It paid off customs officials to avoid taxes. It offered jobs and wages to some while suppressing labor movements and strikes with private guards and friendly governments. It sold bananas to the U.S., but it sold obedience to the locals. The company became a darling of Wall Street. To Americans, it represented exotic commerce, clean profits, and steady growth. But to millions in Central America, it represented something else entirely: colonialism in corporate form. By the early 20th century, United Fruit wasn't just a business. It was an empire, and it didn't need an army. In theory, these were sovereign nations. In practice, they were company towns with flags. By the early 20th century, United Fruit didn't just operate in Central America, it dictated terms. The company held vast land concessions, controlled customs routes, and offered jobs in regions where the government had little presence. In places like Honduras, Guatemala, and Costa Rica, it became the de facto authority, not elected, not accountable, but absolutely in control. It all started with the land. United Fruit didn't buy what was available. It bought what mattered: fertile plains, key rail corridors, access to harbors. In Guatemala alone, it owned over 550,000 acres, much of it unused but held to prevent local farmers from gaining power. This land wasn't just for growing bananas, it was a bargaining chip. When governments proposed land reforms or tried to tax exports, United Fruit threatened to pull out and take the economy with it. And when pressure didn't work, money did. Bribery became routine. Customs officials were paid off to waive fees. Politicians were given campaign donations or outright gifts. Infrastructure projects like railways or medical clinics were promised in exchange for tax holidays, labor concessions, or immunity from regulation. The company framed these deals as partnerships, but they were transactions designed to buy loyalty and suppress resistance. Meanwhile, workers in United Fruit's fields lived in a different reality. They were often paid in company scrip, redeemable only at company stores. Wages were low, conditions were brutal. Organized labor was discouraged, and in some cases, violently crushed with help from local militias or government forces. Healthcare, education, even housing were all controlled by the company. Leaving the plantation meant losing your income, your home, and often your identity. This was capitalism as captivity. In some towns, the company even owned the churches and schools. Children were taught using curriculum provided by United Fruit. Company doctors delivered babies. Company police maintained order. The company was the state, a private empire wrapped in local flags. United Fruit didn't need soldiers. It had monopoly power. Entire communities relied on it for survival, and that dependency ensured obedience. National laws were rewritten to suit corporate needs. Constitutions were adjusted. Leaders who resisted found themselves marginalized, exiled, or worse. And all the while, the company maintained a carefully curated image abroad. In the United States, it portrayed itself as a civilizing force, bringing jobs, technology, and order to undeveloped regions. But in Central America, people understood the truth. The fruit company didn't just harvest bananas. It harvested governments. It bought roads, ports, and rail lines. But most of all, it bought silence. The phrase, "banana republic," wasn't born in a textbook. It came from a short story written by American author O. Henry after fleeing to Honduras in the early 1900s. He wasn't being metaphorical. He'd seen firsthand what it meant. A fragile country propped up by a foreign corporation where the president answered not to the people, but to the plantations. And for decades, that wasn't fiction. It was foreign policy. By the 1920s, United Fruit had become so powerful in Central America that governments rose and fell depending on the company's priorities. Elections were often meaningless. Constitutions were rewritten with company input. In Honduras, United Fruit held bankroll coups to install leaders who would grant land exemptions and suppress labor strikes. The government functioned, but only as long as it served the company's bottom line. When politicians resisted, they didn't last long. In Costa Rica, Guatemala, Colombia, and Nicaragua, leaders who tried to regulate United Fruit faced immediate retaliation politically, economically, or worse. Some were pressured into exile. Others were overthrown. A few disappeared altogether. The term banana republic came to mean something specific: a nation whose political system exists to serve foreign commercial interests, not its citizens. And it wasn't just governance. The press in these countries often fell under United Fruit's influence too. Newspapers were offered generous advertising deals as long as they ran favorable coverage. Journalists critical of the company faced censorship, harassment, or loss of livelihood. In more extreme cases, even violence. The company didn't need to own a country outright. It just needed to own the narrative. In many of these nations, schools were underfunded, healthcare was privatized, and public works were neglected, except where the company needed them. Meanwhile, executives in the U.S. boardrooms assured shareholders of stability in the region. But that stability was a house of cards built on repression, bribes, and a very deliberate kind of silence. Workers who protested poor conditions were painted as agitators or radicals. Strikes were met with police batons, company-backed militias, or worse. In Colombia, the 1928 Banana Massacre saw the military open fire on striking workers demanding better conditions. Estimates of the dead range from several dozen to over 1,000. United Fruit denied responsibility. The U.S. government looked the other way. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a system where a fruit company could shape borders, rewrite laws, and determine who governed, where democracy was a storefront and the stockroom was corporate rule, all while selling bananas for a nickel a pound in American supermarkets wrapped in sunshine and smiles. And the damage went beyond economics. For millions, it created a psychological legacy, one where foreign control was normal and justice was optional. Banana Republic became a joke in the developed world. But in Central America, it was a lived reality. A republic in name, a corporation in practice. In 1951, Guatemala chose a new kind of leader. Jacobo Arbenz was young, idealistic, and determined to break the old order. He wasn't a revolutionary with a rifle. He was a reformer with a law book. And what he saw in his country disgusted him. a feudal system wrapped in a foreign flag. At the time, over 70% of the nation's arable land was owned by just 2% of the population. The largest landowner by far? A foreign corporation, United Fruit Company. They held over 500,000 acres, much of it lying unused not to feed the people, but to block competition and hoard profit. Meanwhile, millions of Guatemalans lived in poverty, landless, powerless, and locked into debt. Arbenz proposed Decree 900, a sweeping agrarian reform. It wasn't revolutionary by global standards. Landowners would be compensated, farmers would receive small plots, and local cooperatives would take root. But what made it dangerous was the source of that compensation, the declared tax value of the land. For years, United Fruit had grossly undervalued its land to avoid taxation. Now, that number would come back to haunt them. Arbenz offered them payment, but not at inflated prices. He offered them exactly what they had claimed their land was worth. It was legal, it was fair, and to United Fruit, it was intolerable. Inside Guatemala, the reform was electrifying. Rural families who had never owned a single acre now held deeds in their hands. Fields once overgrown were tilled and planted. Hope spread like wildfire. It wasn't just about land. It was about dignity, a chance to live without foreign permission. But power doesn't let go quietly. The Guatemalan elite recoiled. The military, long used to serving external interests, grew uneasy. And newspapers, some locally owned, others quietly influenced, began repeating a single word: communism. Arbenz was no communist. He had no Soviet ties, no foreign ideology behind him. His wife was Swiss. His model was Western, a social democracy rooted in national control, not global revolution. But Cold War paranoia didn't care about accuracy. It cared about leverage. And United Fruit saw its opening. They couldn't win this battle in Guatemala, but they could win it in Washington. The land redistribution continued, but the air grew tense. Farmers were digging into soil that, for decades, had been off limits. They didn't know it yet, but their new crops were growing on a fault line. A confrontation was coming, not between armies, but between sovereignty and influence. And only one would survive. What Guatemala called reform, the United States called a crisis. After Decree 900 passed, United Fruit didn't waste time arguing in local courts. It went straight to Washington, not with lawyers, but with lobbyists, and not with facts, but with fear. The company's message was simple: Guatemala was falling to communism. They hired Edward Bernays, the same public relations pioneer who once sold cigarettes as torches of freedom. Now, he was selling something darker: the idea that a democratically elected president redistributing farmland was a Trojan horse for Soviet takeover. His media campaign flooded American newspapers with warnings of red infiltration in the Western Hemisphere. Never mind that Arbenz wasn't aligned with Moscow. The facts were secondary. The story was the weapon. And United Fruit had friends in the right places. At the top of the U.S. State Department sat John Foster Dulles. At the helm of the CIA, his brother, Allen Dulles. Both had deep ties to Sullivan and Cromwell, the law firm that once represented United Fruit. These weren't just policymakers, they were insiders. The kind of men who could blur the line between national interest and private profit without blinking. The CIA drew up a plan, Operation PB Success. Its mission was surgical overthrow Arbenz without leaving American fingerprints. The agency trained a small rebel force, led by an exiled military officer, Carlos Castillo Armas. They armed them, backed them with psychological warfare, and staged fake radio broadcasts to create panic. CIA aircraft dropped leaflets over the capital. Rumors of an unstoppable invasion began to spread. It was theater, but it worked. Guatemalan generals, uncertain of where the truth ended and American power began, urged Arbenz to resign. On the 27th of June, 1954, he stepped down, burning key documents before fleeing the presidential palace barefoot and humiliated. The first and last Guatemalan president to challenge United Fruit was gone toppled not by a revolution, but by a campaign. It wasn't just a coup, it was a proof of concept. From this moment forward, the Cold War became a shield for corporate intervention. Any Latin American leader who touched land reform, nationalized industry, or resisted U.S. economic interests was branded a threat and removed, sometimes by rebels, sometimes by generals, but always, somewhere behind the curtain, by money. United Fruit didn't need to raise an army. It just needed a phone line to Washington. And Washington always answered. The planes flew home, the deals were signed, but Guatemala was never the same. After the 1954 coup, the land reforms were reversed, the peasant collectives dismantled, the military, emboldened and backed by U.S. aid, took control of the state. Over the next 4 decades, Guatemala descended into civil war. More than 200,000 people were killed. Tens of thousands more disappeared. Entire villages were erased. The violence wasn't random. It was rooted in that moment, when a corporation proved it could decide who governed. And Guatemala wasn't alone. In Honduras, Nicaragua, Colombia, and Panama, similar patterns unfolded. Military regimes, economic dependency, widespread poverty, paired with modern ports and manicured plantations. The contradiction was sharp. Countries rich in resources, yet crippled by inequality and corruption. The profits went north, the suffering stayed behind. The long-term effects were generational. Families fractured. Trust in government collapsed. National identity eroded under decades of foreign control. Entire populations grew up in a state of political fear, taught that real change was dangerous, even deadly. United Fruit, facing increasing backlash and scrutiny, rebranded. It became Chiquita Brands International in the 1980s, trading images of boardroom imperialism for cartoon bananas and supermarket smiles. But behind the stickers, the system remained. Cheap labor, vast land holdings, quiet lobbying. In 2007, Chiquita admitted to paying nearly $1.7 million to a Colombian paramilitary group classified by the U.S. as a terrorist organization. The more things changed, the more they stayed the same. But perhaps the most dangerous legacy wasn't just in Central America. It was in the method. United Fruit didn't need to occupy countries to control them. It used infrastructure, dependency, and narrative control. It co-opted the press. It exploited fear. It privatized politics. That blueprint, refined in the jungles of Central America, became a template for global corporate influence in the 21st century. Today, it's not bananas. It's data, oil, housing, pharmaceuticals, even social media. But the logic hasn't changed. Own the supply, control the story, shape the state. And so, the legacy of United Fruit isn't just written in blood and bananas. It's written in the very idea that a corporation can be more powerful than a country and not even need a bullet to prove it. United Fruit never marched troops through the capital. It never dropped bombs or occupied palaces. It didn't have to. It bought influence in backrooms, signed deals behind closed doors, and rewrote the future with nothing but a ledger and a phone call. This wasn't a war, it was a transaction. What happened in Guatemala wasn't an accident. It was a playbook, one that proved you don't need a military to conquer a country. Just control the infrastructure, the economy, the narrative. And that playbook didn't disappear. It evolved. Today, companies don't just sell you products. They sell you identities, shape your choices, and in some cases help write the laws that govern you. From energy giants to data monopolies, the line between corporate interest and public policy has never been blurrier. The real power often isn't in the spotlight. It's in the shadows. In the lobbyist's briefcase, the secret clause in a trade deal, the smiling executive shaking hands with the president. So if this story made you rethink the power of corporations, if it made you wonder who's really making the rules, don't let it end here. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications because these stories aren't just history. They're blueprints for the present, and sometimes the most dangerous empires don't wear uniforms, they wear suits.